14.3 may feel similar to last patch, but the reality is this is the most diverse meta we've seen in terms of what comps can do well if you know the conditions of it. Well, thankfully, I have the ultimate 14.3 tier list that shows off dozens of comps that are viable in the metagame with the proper conditions, so that way you can have maximum chance to succeed. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Mobalytics, who is helping bring you guys this video. Mobalytics is a dedicated data website to help you find the analysis and edge you need to climb. Check out their stuff at mobalytics.gg/TFT, where you can find compositions by myself, Dishsoap, and many other top players in North America. By downloading their overlay, you can get meta comps in-game, as well as look at different community comps and my own compositions I'm using to climb. It's also the overlay that I use that recommends me real-time data of augments, as well as other information happening in the lobby, so that I can stay up to date. Download the app so you can get your best comps in-game with the Mobalytics overlay. Let's get a brief snapshot of the metagame and look at it holistically. Starting at the very top at S tier is Heartsteel and level 9 boards, things that play like Jazz or AD Flex in general, anchored around Ezreal and Zed in the mid game. And then late game, you're taking in things like Lucian. I included Caitlyn because she's buffed now, so you can definitely play her in some of these Heartsteel AD boards. Then below, you have a bunch of reroll comps, and I do think that reroll is going to be a big part of the metagame still. I think every lobby should have a couple of 2 and 3 cost rerolls. 2 cost seems to be primarily really strong right now. Kayle and Senna and Seraphine are very good. And if you can go for a Katarina, it is conditional, but pretty solid if you're able to hit her. Punk is still good for top 4s, as are Pentakill and KDA Ahri boards. This includes things like Ahri Warriors or just Spellweavers. Still very solid core, and this would be the majority of what you're looking to play if you're not able to hit Ezreal. And then the A tier stuff are things that just need something to really enable it, like Batch Jazz Baby for Jazz, or Gargantuan Resolve Olaf with a lot of Olafs. Things like Twin Terror for Lulu, or Hologram, Country Spats, Expose Weakness. And then also like things like Lux too. She can actually hang with the best if you're able to get to that board. And then towards the bottom of A tier is things that you might see every now and then, but they really need the proper setup. Otherwise, they're not going to actually shine. They're very conditional for the most part. Disco is actually playable, but you really need to have a specific spot that makes Disco shine. And then Jax and Lux are about the same power level. Actually, a lot of people are saying that they think Jax is better at higher levels, but up until around like Masters and GM, I think Jax is a little bit worse than Lux 3 because Lux 3 can punish harder. 1 cost reroll in general, and this includes Olaf and potentially a little bit of Jinx as well, I think is a little bit on the dicey side, very conditional. And then a lot of people are just contesting Yone right now, so it's just hard to hit Yone 3, but he is good if you can get him. Most things are viable in the metagame. The only thing I do want to encourage you to avoid is probably Garen reroll. A lot of people are trying to make it work. I believe Keen is actually a person that almost exclusively played Garen reroll for like an entire day, and it did not go well. So try it if you want, but I'm not a big believer of it. That being said, I do have a video of me playing Garen reroll, so it's not like you can't ever do well with it. But if you're trying to climb seriously, I would avoid playing it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the tier list itself. Starting at the very top is going to be the composition that wins most of the lobbies due to its sheer power level. Heartsteel and 5 costs. Ezreal is the main anchor from the backline that people tend to focus on, but the big revelation is just how powerful specifically Poppy and Zed are at level 8. If you get Poppy or Zed as a headliner, they are much stronger than Ezreal, because if you do have a 1-star Ezreal, you could theoretically stall long enough for, Poppy and Zed and Zac and Set to kind of mess around the front line, while Ezreal is able to still get things like the burn and AoE damage. But if you have 1-star Poppy, 1-star Zed, and 2-star Ezreal, chances are these units are going to fold very quickly to other people who have their carries online, and then all of a sudden your Ezreal gets swarmed. And so a lot of times people are focusing more on the front line and then trying to build onto the back line. A lot of times when you're trying to play for this composition, you're thinking about early Heartsteel as your main condition. That's the when. And then you try to prioritize a bunch of AD and sword items. So things like Edge of Night, Giant Slayer, and Gunblade are really powerful on Zed. Gunblade probably the most underrated item on Zed in particular, because people think more about like BT and Hands of Justice, but he's really good because of how much damage he deals, and he often overkills units, and the Hex Tech Gunblade can be really good for a burst healing onto Poppy, and it's also a really steady damage output. So yeah, this composition is still going to win a lot of lobbies. It did get nerfed stage 5 and 6. It's weaker, but it still caps really high. And while it's a touch slower than it used to be in terms of ramping up in the late game, it's still going to win most of your lobbies. One thing I want to say about early game and mid game is that I think a lot of people start off with Heartsteel and they think that they want to actually lose a lot to get the early lose streak bonuses. But in reality, the strongest way, theoretically the best way to guarantee first, is to play with a lot of HP, enter stage 4 with as much HP close to 100 as you can, and then start to get things like 5 Heartsteel and raise the stakes so you can lose all those rounds and get a big time cash out. So if you're able to execute that, that is the best possible way that you can get a first place with this composition. But chances are you're not going to actually do that in a lot of games unless you have like a very strong early game high roll, which if you want to, you just basically play around some of those really powerful things like Olaf and Vi and Kazante. Caitlyn is buffed, and she is an alternative to playing some of these Heartsteel boards. And a lot of times, you're going to be low rolling your Heartsteel. You roll, you don't hit Ezreal, you don't hit Zed. Instead, you hit like rapid fire 8-bit Caitlyn. If so, you should buy her and play around her and try to find a way to get to 9. This is sort of an extension, but I'm calling it like AD Flex, and you do have some options. This is a Heartsteel example of playing around like Kazante with Garen as your 8-bit and your Sentinel, and then you have Set and Aphelios. Let's say you have like a rapid fire headliner and you hit the Lucian, you have 4 rapid fire. You can totally play this to 9 as long as you have like defensive items onto Poppy or Set appropriately. So this is like one thing you could play, for example. But if you don't hit like Lucian, because that's like a little bit of a high roll in itself, let's say you hit like no 5 cost whatsoever, you can still do things like play around Akali, and let's say you hit 8-bit Caitlyn instead. You can go for a Echo and get true damage and try to play like dual carry with Poppy as your frontliner, and then Akali as your Zed and Caitlyn as your backliner. And then this gives you another flex opportunity while getting Heartsteel still into your board and also trying to push for 9. But ultimately, you don't want to stay onto Caitlyn level 9. There's a lot of players that feel like they can't sell her, but in reality, you're trying to look for an upgrade. And that's how you can play one way to stall to roll over into like an Ezreal, Lucian, Jhin type of late game while you play some of these underplayed 4-cost carries. Kayle is one of the strongest real comps that you'll be seeing a lot in the metagame, largely because of her rework, which has been successful, and the fact that she ends up scaling really well with one of the best vertical traits in the game, Pentakill. If you're able to get to 7 Pentakill Kayle and you're able to kind of play the rest of the usual stuff like Viego and Karthus, instead of having like Akali, for example, as your third carry in that composition, you're playing Kayle, and she scales really nicely. She also holds over your early mid game really nicely because headliner Kayle is probably the strongest 2-cost headliner currently in the game. And Kayle ends up doing a lot of work if you're able to give her like Rage Blade, Gunblade +1. That's usually her bis. In this case example, we have something like Shojin and Deathcap. Those are also like serviceable things. Deathcap's probably a lot better than Shojin, but I think Gunblade is the big discovery we've had lately that is very, very powerful on her. And you can also play all kinds of front lines because as long as you get like Olaf headliner or even, early bruisers and just stall for Caitlyn with Rage Blade, it's very, very good. And Rage Blade is one of the most popular like slams early game anyways because of how it scales and definitely takes advantage of slow-paced early games on stage 2. So if you have a Rage Blade plus Kayle setup, think about rerolling Kayle. The best augment you can possibly get is Metalheads because it gives you kind of like a Quicksilver effect and also it heals, which is really nice. It's 2 in 1. But if not, just go for other generic combat stuff like Harmless is really good, or anything that helps end up making your composition a lot tankier. Aspiring Epitaph ends up being also pretty decent as well. So sometimes it helps you get that attack speed scaling. Don't forget that as much as you want to go for all these crazy carries with like Karthus and Viego, you do want to tank. Mordekaiser is your best reliable tank, but a lot of times early game is going to be Olaf. And then the other thing to consider is that right now, Rage Blade is actually bugged on Kayle, which is kind of an unfortunate thing. We're not entirely sure, but there is a condition where I think if something summons onto the field, like 5 Pentakill activates or Yorick summons like a ghoul or whatever, it resets Kayle's Rage Blade stacks, specifically on things like the Superfan. And so it ends up becoming really awkward, in particular when you play Superfan Kayle and she ends up just getting a bunch of reset stacks. I'm not entirely sure how to replicate it, but it is impactful. And so a lot of people are saying that Kayle is this strong despite being bugged. But if you also feel like Kayle is underperforming randomly for you, it could be because of that bug. It's kind of funny that we're putting Kayle in S tier despite the fact that she has a bugged interaction with her best item, Rage Blade. But it is that good if things go well. And yeah, like it doesn't really matter if you're able to try to play around it because it's going to trigger in multitude of ways. Reroll comps in general can still hang with the best. They're not going to beat a lot of the Heartsteel boards, but not many comps will. And so if your criteria is, does it beat Heartsteel? No. If not, that the comp is like not S tier or not good, then chances are you're probably going to play like really narrow on ladder. And I think that this comp, like Senna, is very consistent on climbing if you have the right conditions. The time that you're trying to play Senna is when you get a lot of Sennas and rods. Sometimes you start off with like a Senna pair and you have like a rod, or maybe you get an augment like Magic Wand where you get like a rod opener, and component anvils get you more rods. This is because Senna scales really well with AP. Her best item is Death Cap, and Shojin is the super fan item that she gets. And you can even go for like multiple rod items based on her. Even things like Jewel Gauntlet, Gunblade, other rod based items are really, really powerful on Senna in particular. Blinged Out is the best augment to think about when playing this composition. And things like Jewel Lotus are really powerful because it helps you amplify your crits. Also, Ramping Rhythm is a underrated augment in general, and you want to have things that really engage fast because True Damage wants to burst their opponents. But this gives you some scaling, so Ramping Rhythm is also a really good augment to think about as well. Only thing about know about positioning is to put Senna towards the center because she does AoE that fans out. So you want to put her in the bottom center and not in the corner. That way she can get max amount of surface area onto your opponents. And then straightforward early mid game, just play around super fans and true damage early, and make sure you roll on 6. Try not to roll to 0 ever when you're playing these level 6 reroll comps, because you do need to eventually push levels, and if you just go to 0, you're going to be struggling a lot in the mid to late game. But sometimes if you are really, really far behind and you just have no choice, you just gotta send it. Seraphine is a really powerful reroll composition that's been slowly climbing the ranks in other regions. And I think North America is like the last region where it started to gain popularity. It started off in China, then has moved over to SCA, then EU, and now finally North America. And it's largely predicated around the fact that all these Spellweavers are really powerful at specific points of the game. Early mid-game, Seraphine is really dominant because if you get Headliner Seraphine, she ends up not only dealing a lot of damage, but also sustaining herself with her Headliner ability. And then as the game progresses, you're able to get really powerful anti-melee champions like Lulu and Ahri, which are really powerful against things like, you know, the Zed and other units that are trying to dive into your backline. And so I think this composition is just powerful at all stages of the game and gives you a lot of ways to curve out into an easy top 2, top 3. The way you can win the game is if you get to Sona and you're able to get like Sona 2 and deck out the rest of your composition at 9. In general, you're looking for like Shojin plus anti-heal. If you don't have Shojin, you can also go for blue buff if you can't get like a sword. And the anti-heal is very versatile on Seraphine. You can go for red buff or you can go for Morel Nomicon. Both are pretty close in the data, so pretty much just pick whatever you want. Leftover items on Lulu and Ahri, and if you can somehow get all of them going, you're in a good spot. The weakest part about this composition is that your front line is Nico and Echo, which is not very reliable. You're trying to play around Echo 2 and Nico 2 when people are playing, you know, like Lucian 2, Jin 2. All the house show stuff late game can feel like it's pretty weak. And so if you find any way to support your front line in any possible way, you know, going for Nico 3, Echo 3, or other support items, for example, definitely try to do so. Riven is the strongest 3-cost reroll currently in the game, and is because 6 8-bit is incredibly strong, and by itself kind of brings it to S+ tier, as I noted at the very bottom of my priority list. But also just still a really reliable comp to play because people aren't really tagging things like Riven in their composition, and is least contested based off available units. This is in contrast to other 3-cost rerolls. So if we're talking about like Yone or Lulu or Vex or these other 3-costs that are really strong, they are played in other different compositions, even if they're not their primary carry. However, nobody's picking up Riven in their reroll compositions or other compositions that are just playing even edgelords because she's not featured outside of her own individual comp. Her best items are Quicksilver, BT, and Giant Slayer, although you could theoretically go for like Titan instead of Giant Slayer. It's just a lot lower damage, so you have to make sure that you have like, you know, Caitlyn and Viego items, so you have the trio carry in that spot. Also, don't forget tank items on Mordekaiser, Even Shroud, really important, as well as anti-heal. Best augments to think about are things that give you a reason to just reroll like a ton of econ, because you just need a lot of gold to hit Riven 3 on time relative to all the 2 costs and the Heartsteel players. So March of Progress is my favorite because it feels like an excuse to roll for Riven because you can't really use your gold for EXP. And then things like, you know, team building or heroic grab bag, people sometimes take that and play in Riven. As well as other things like Cool Pact or other econ augments like that. Combat augments that you really want for her are things like healing, like Harm Assist, or Healing Orbs, or Vampirism. Those are also really good for Riven as well. Punk has gone through a couple of iterations now, and because of how consistent it is, even at like a Masters and GM level, we're putting it here in like S tier, but it's like towards the bottom. Might actually even be A tier, but I think that because of its consistency alone and the results that it gets, people still really like it. Primarily because of the fact that you're able to get like early tempo with the Jinx. If you have a lot of Punk units and you have like bows, you can go for a Jinx play. Her best item that a lot of people will play around is Rage Blade, and you can also find success without Rage Blade as long as you have a lot of bows. You can go for like Runins, Last Whisper plus Death Blade, for example, or Giant Slayer. There's a lot of different ways that you can capitalize onto it. The one item that people don't really play that's an AD as a third item here on Jinx is IE. You don't want Infinity Edge because it doesn't really interact with her ability very much. At the same time, sometimes you just slam whatever you can get because those are the items you have. The other carries that you can play around are like Twitch, if you get a lot of Twitches and you want to play around Twitch Vex, or if you want to play around Vi as your other carry, which I made an entire video about people playing Vi carry in tournaments. But I got a lot of negative feedback because people were like, this doesn't work. And in reality, it's a composition that's a lot more niche than people think it is. It doesn't mean that every time you have a punk spot, you're supposed to play Vi. It just means that you can play Vi if the right conditions line up. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop recommending it because I think that it's ended up doing more harm than good. Best augment to think about is extended play, but I think the honorable mention goes to heroic presence. Both are really good signals to play as comp. And you can also use a bunch of the combat augments that are really good. Like if you get something like unified resistance because you get so much HP, or martyr. You can also take other things like economy stuff with prismatic ticket, frequent flyer, etc. But personally, I wouldn't be trying to play punk anyways unless I had a lot of them. So econ doesn't feel nearly as important since you get discounted rolls. I'd rather have a lot of combat stuff so I can keep up with a lot of the comps in the mid and late game. And remember, you're trying to play punk to preserve a lot of HP. You're trying to win streak early and then fall off late game and bleed to like a third or fourth. And this comp is extremely good at doing that. So if you're really far behind and you're like lose streaking all of stage 2 and still losing in stage 3, chances are it's not a really good punk spot and you should be thinking about something else. At the very top of A tier, we have Pentakill Akali, although right now this line has transformed a lot to just become Pentakill Flex. Pentakill Flex is anchored around Superfan with Gnar, Nico, and Lilia instead of Kennen, and then trying to play around whatever you can hit as your headliner. The headliner strength priority right now is Viego is better than Karthus, and then Karthus is better than Akali. But in reality, you can actually play like a ton of different variations of this. One example I put at the very bottom of the priority list is Ahri, for example. You could just play Ahri and then play like 4 Superfan, headliner Akali, and Ahri, and then kind of play like a variation of Ahri Warriors or Ahri Superfan. And then kind of Tekken Pentakill with like a trio carry instead of Viego. You can play like Karthus, Akali, and Ahri. And there's a lot of different variations that you can kind of mix and match depending on what you hit. So it's a really cool line to learn. The conditions of when I usually go for this is when you have like a really strong Superfan opener with a lot of tempo items with like, Olaf, for example. You play around Olaf, you have like BT Titans. Okay, you can like play around any kind of forecast that you hit around Viego, or you can put these BT Titans on Akali or Hodge, or any kind of variations, and then slap whatever mana items on Karthus. And then you just like play like a really strong high HP setup and get to level 8, roll down, and hit one of these headliners. The comp is usually top 4 oriented when you're stuck on 8, and the way you like do better than that is to get to level 9 and go for Yorick. If you can get to Yorick, that's when you want to go for 7 Pentakill, because 7 Pentakill is by now like known to be an extremely strong synergy, but you're not really going to go for it unless you get Yorick. And the reason is because you're playing too many low quality units. You're playing like Olaf in the late stage of the game and a Kayle, and you're not really tying them together with Edgelord, and you're just kind of struggling with this non-Yorick 7 Pentakill. The other variation is if you get a Pentakill emblem on Akali, and then all of a sudden Akali can become like a main, and you just slap whatever stuff on her. Akali is surprisingly really good with almost any anti-heal. You can give her red buff, Morello, or Sunfire, and that's totally fine. Viego just wants AD bruiser items, and so basically anything you put on Olaf, you're willing to put on Viego. Right now, Karthus takes mostly mana items because you don't actually need to build AP on him due to the rework that makes him cast more often and gain a bunch of AP and convert crit to AP. So he actually gets a lot of damage already, but you can also put utility on him and anti-heal. So if you have Morello or red buff, or Shiv, anything like that, you can give to Karthus as well. You do want to have him hold 3 items, and you rather them be like, Shiv, red buff, plus like adaptive or, Shojin, than just like having Shojin on him and then putting random items on somebody else. Best augments for this are items, because you're just going to have so many different carries you want to itemize. So a lot of times people take things like, idealism, buried treasures, even things like Freaky Friday, just getting the Infinity Force, stuff like that. It can be really, really good. And the items help you fight for tempo really fast early on. So you can spike really easily when you get to 3 carries. And you carry that all the way to a top 2 and above if you're able to get like items on 4 carries, including Yorick. KDA Ahri is also still very strong. It's largely anchored around Superfan, and then Ahri as your non-headliner, and then you play a 4-cost melee that you ideally carry around that makes sense for your items. So a lot of times you're playing Akali because it makes sense to just play like vertical KDA. And 7 KDA is pretty decent, like it just gives a lot of tempo and cruises to an easy top 4 if you're playing from ahead. And remember, you want to play around non-headliner Ahri, because you're going to play whatever superfan item plus items that make sense for that carry. But still, you want good Ahri items. So if you get like, you know, a bow belt tier opener, you get another tier, you have blue buff Nashers. Now you have your Ahri items set up, and then you can make tank items. And then a lot of times you end up making these 4-cost melee items last, because it kind of depends on like what you hit. So chances are when you do like a roll down on 4-2, unless you have like a specific set of items already made. So chances are the most common setup that you'll have for success is at 4-2 or 4-1. When you get to level 8 and you roll, you have Ahri items done, you have like most of your tank done, and you have like maybe one item ready for 4 cost, but you're like dependent on what you hit is what you're going to slam. Early game opener is largely dependent on whether or not you have superfan plus an AP item holder of some kind. So in this case, they play like Evelynn as your example without the superfan, but you can play like Evelynn and Crowd Divers. And then you can kind of transition to like a pretty standard KDA board. This is just an example of playing around Evelynn still, but Evelynn drops off. Probably want to play around Seraphine or Kai'Sa. Those are much better 2-cost headliners, two of the best. Tank items go on Echo and Nico. You're still going to struggle in the late game with these being 2-stars, so if you can get 3-star, that would be great. And going into a team builder, the 4-cost priority is Zed is just the best right now, and you give him like, you know, Edge of Night and GS, which is really, really powerful. Akali, you can just give her like red buff and Hodge. She gets another Hodge from Superfan. Poppy, you can make her kind of like a hybrid tank. Viego, you end up giving him more AD items. Surprisingly, Viego in this setup is actually just really good with straight up AD. Like you go like IE Hodge on him, he actually kind of goes like crazy. This composition really thrives off of a lot of combat augments in particular, because you're just going to amplify the effectiveness of your front line through a lot of HP. That's why things like Cybernetic Bulk makes sense. And also just a lot of damage. Just make sure that you have a lot of power, but you can also take items and economy. Kind of all just depends on the context. Just generally play the strong early game and get to level 8 and roll. Katarina is still really good, but she is going to struggle with something that a lot of reroll comps are going to encounter in this tier, which is that a lot of your secondary units are contested and hard to hit. So in this case, Katarina is a crowd diver. If you can hit her 3-star and you get the Zed and the Kiana and the Yone online, great. But Yone and Zed are contested, and while you're not necessarily like trying to go for Yone 3, which you theoretically can, it's going to be hard to hit Zed too. So many people are trying to pull Zed in their Ahri lines or in their Ezreal Heartsteel stuff. Zed's just a really hard 2-star 4-cost to get right now, but if you can, really good spot to play this Katarina. Usually the time I think about Katarina is if I have a lot of econ early and I hit cats plus gloves, because you get 1 hand of justice already from Katarina, so you need 2 gloves, 1 rod, 1 tier. So multiple gloves gives you the opportunity to go into Katarina. And a lot of times, Katarina ends up being pretty good either as a country or a crowd diver. If you do have a crowd diver +1, 6 crowd diver is really good. That is one of the upsides of playing Katarina, is that she is a comp that can compete with the very best comps for first place. Jazz is a really solid reroll composition as well. I think that a lot of people are trying to go for Misfortune primarily as the carry, but right now the meta is a lot more oriented around 2-cost reroll than 3. If you do see a lot of people going for 3-cost reroll, you can try to go for MF as a primary, but I personally like Bard a little bit better because he just gets on quicker, and also because he preserves life a lot better in the mid game. Plus, you also get to scale the dudes. Like, who doesn't love the Dude army? His best in slot is not Shojin, actually. We need to fix that. I made a note to the Mobilix tier list folks that they need to update this to blue buff. Instead, you want Adaptive Helm, blue buff, and Jewel Gauntlet. And if you get blue buff, you just instantly cast, and it does wonders for a lot of breakpoints for Bard, and also helps scale him that much quicker. And then in MF, you want like the Deathblade as the superfan item, Last Whisper, and Rageblade. And you want to go for a lot of attack speed because she gets so much damage through Jazz and her big shot trait. Your tanks are going to be Echo and Nico. Usually go for 3-star variations of them if you can. And in reality, you end up trying to roll for like everything 3. You don't really go to 8 very often in this composition unless you are 1, done rolling for your carries, and 2, you're kind of unable to hit things like Echo and Nico, because on 8, the only thing you really want to play is probably like Lucian or Ziggs, maybe, for like Hybrid Pop plus Dazzler. But in reality, you can roll for better frontline always, because if you level up to play anything that isn't Lucian, your frontline doesn't get that much better if you just get like 1 or 2 traits. You'd rather just have like Nico and Echo 3. Best augment is That's Jazz Baby. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. This is a scaling augment. It's really good. A lot of people still misunderstand that the really big breakpoint for That's Jazz Baby is when you get 7 of the traits online, because that's when you scale the AD and AP and they start going crazy. But the other stuff you're not too worried about as well. But the other traits are actually not too bad. Like the HP and the attack speed is pretty nice. Olaf is actually still quite solid and kind of in the middle of this A tier, depending on how good your Olaf spot is. They actually nerfed Olaf 3, but the real thing that's actually kind of a question mark this patch is they didn't nerf Olaf 2. And Olaf 2 is really, really powerful. I compare him a lot to like Cho'Gath from the previous sets, in that Cho'Gath was a 2-cost bruiser that would end up winning stage 2 as you rerolled him because he was strong early. And then if you're able to transition Olaf into like another secondary carry like Karthus, or I don't know, even like a Kayle 3, if you're somehow like rolling 3-star everything, then you end up getting into a really good spot where you preserve a lot of HP, and then you transition to a late game carry and you end the game with like a lot of HP. Finish Resolve is the best augment here. It just is the biggest excuse to go for Olaf. If you have like 4 or 5 Olafs early with Bruiser and you get this augment, just go for it. Too Big to Fail is also pretty good. It just gives you more excuses to play vertical bruisers, so it's just enhancing already something that you're doing. Heavy Hitters is also a really good shout out here. I really like the 3 that we have recommended because it just gives you more stats, although it's not necessarily that important. The other augment that's not featured here that actually might be really good is Twin Terror, by the way. Twin Terror Olaf, low-key, might actually be kind of insane. Executioners is also still a pretty strong comp. It's just no longer nearly as bananas S tier as it was previous patch. And it goes hand in hand into 2 variations. One is like full executioners, and you use like the Karthus and the Akali, and then the other is to play around country, to play around like the strong Dreadsteed with Hecarim. The first variation that I like to play is personally just the crit for days executioners, because it feels a lot less item dependent. Most of the times you're playing Vex as your primary carry and headliner, but you have so much more flexibility. You could hit executioner Twitch, go for Twitch 3, and then hit everything. You can go for Guardian and Mumu and play for like 4 Guardians instead of like 6 Executioners. You can play like 4 Executioners, 4 Guardians, and go for a Mumu Headliner because he's very, very good. And so you have a lot of different ways that you can actually play around this. Even Samira 3 without country, just give her Executioner items, and Twitch takes the backseat. You just go Samira Vex. And I like that versatility a lot. The country variation is also pretty solid as well, but the only reason why I think the country variation is actually still good is because 7 country is very, very good. If you get 7 country and you roll for a Mumu 3, Set 3, Samira 3, Vex 3, Urgot 3, like, you can win the game for the most part because you just have way too much stats and you have way too many carries. You have Samira carry, Vex carry, Urgot carry, and you have the horse carry, and low-key the Mumu is a carry as well. Laser Show is back on the menu. Lux got buffed this patch, and now she does a lot of damage. And if you get a spot with Lux where you can get a bunch of rods, you are good to go. The recommended items that you go for Lux is Death Cap, Gunblade, and Archangels, but you're rarely going to get that many rods because you sometimes need a Spark as well if you don't have Shiv. So, Giant Slayer is just an example of a different way you can build her if you don't have like enough rods, which is why, funny enough, Pandora's ends up being pretty good. Also, I think another secret sauce of what makes this comp really good is that I think Radiant Death Cap is bananas on Lux in particular. I think it raises her average placement by over 1. So you go from like what could be a top 4 oriented comp to like a top 3 oriented comp minimum, and you just delete so many carries. Like I've seen Radiant Death Cap or Radiant Archangels, whatever, like one of the really powerful Radiant items on her just absolutely destroy like the Ezreal and that Lucian almost instantly, and then your opponent can't play the game. If you don't know how to play Lux, I made a TFT Academy guide video. It's one of my first ones I made about how you can think about Lux. So check out the video if you need a little bit more in-depth analysis of like what to do and how to set things up in the early and mid game. Lulu Reroll is probably one of my favorite comps this entire set. I think it's just so fun to see the Hyper Pop go crazy and Lulu just buff each other to give each other recursive amount of attack speed and mana. And there's 2 ways you can actually achieve that. One is to play Lulu with Twin Terror. So when you 3-star Lulu, you get another copy of her. The other is to pick Hologram. And Hologram helps you get a second copy of your headliner, aka 2 Hyperpop Lulus. Hyperpop is way better than Spellweaver if you're able to get to it. I personally think that Spellweaver Lulu is a lot weaker, almost to the point where I would consider like buying it temporarily and then selling it later on before I get Lulu 3. And you're going to roll at level 7 and kind of play like a pretty standard Spellweaver game, like almost as if you're going to reroll Annie or just play Ahri, but you have the out of playing Lulu as well. And you can also play 2 Lulus in the mid game as well. The way you do cap out this board is Ziggs. If you find Ziggs, that's also really good. And if you somehow get another Hyperpop emblem, some capacity, you get 4 Hyperpop, you can win the game. Lulu's Biss is a mana item. So in this case, we have Nashor's plus Shojin. I was actually told that Nashor's actually has a mana lock, as she can't get mana after she's casting with the attack speed buff. So you could just probably go like double Shojin or blue buff and then go for either Gunblade or AP. That's really, really good. leftover items on Ahri, and if you can itemize second Lulu, like in Twin Terror case, you just give her mana items. Mana is like so important because the more mana you get, the more you're ramping Lulu, and the more you're ramping the other units because of Spellweaver, the trait. Every time they cast, you get AP. So it's just a really, really cool cycle. That's why things like pumping up and also can be pretty good too, because you get more attack speed, aka more mana. Disco is back because Twisted Fate got buffed, and now the mana reduction helps significantly, especially if you're able to get like, mana chain casting with like, the Shojin Rage Blade type stuff, or maybe red buff. But, as long as you really get anti-heal, mana and AP, like some combination, it's really, really good on Twisted Fate. In fact, I'm pretty sure Twisted Fate items don't really matter. If you look at the stats, they're all very close and condensed within like 1 or 2 tenths. The really important thing is to avoid getting stuck at 8s. Don't get stuck on 8s. You really care about getting combat augments and getting to level 9. Get those 5 costs like Ziggs, Alawi, and Sona, and you are good to go. Jax Reroll is also buffed because Lux got buffed, and Jax's damage is a little bit stronger now, so you could go for a Jax reroll and try to play around Tempo Jax, specifically with Moshers. The main condition that I think about playing Jax is when I have early Moshers and Submit to the Pit. Unlike most 2-cost rerolls, you're actually rolling for this comp at 7 because you want the 4-cost odds as well, and your chances only reduced from 40 to 35, so it's still pretty decent. And Lux 3 is still a really good out to play for to stack AP, so you can go for that as well. That's in slot Jax. You want JG, Hodge, maybe even a second Hodge, Giant Slayer, like something else damage-wise. You can also give Titan's Resolve, especially if you go things like Gargantuan Resolve. Jazz is a really good way to outfit the rest of your traits and just make sure you have good frontline. And yeah, I think this is like pretty straightforward. Jax DD is back, but I do think that it's not really that common. A lot of these comps in A tier are just really conditional, and you're not always supposed to jam them every single time you can. But I want to put this ultimate tier list together so that you understand like when to play it and what's the general game plan of it. Annie Reroll is still very good if you have a spot for her. Mainly, the condition for her is going for Emo Annie, and you have a lot of copies of Annie because you don't want to reroll. The big problem with 1-cost reroll right now in general is that you just don't want to spend a lot of economy on it, and this applies to Olaf, to Yasuo, to Annie, and any other 1-cost you choose to reroll. It's just, if you end up missing at all, like even a little bit, you're just very, very far behind. And so it's just high risk, surprisingly, to go for a 1-cost reroll right now. And that's because if you're behind on tempo, you're not able to win stage 3. And if you're not winning stage 3, you're going to definitely lose stage 4 and possibly most of 5 because of Heartsteel and a bunch of the 4-cost like Pentakill Ahri stuff. So you're just going to have this giant window of punishment, and there's no guarantee that you'll be able to turn the ship around. So you really need to make sure that you're able to spike decisively and hit. And that's a big reason why a lot of people don't want to play around 1-cost reroll right now. Best in slot Annie is a mana item, usually Shojin or blue buff. If you are playing Emo Annie, you want to play blue buff, but if you're playing like Spellweaver Annie, probably just Shojin is fine. The JG is a superfan item, so usually you just let that cook, and then you just play like the other units taking items. Echo is your better tank, but you can oftentimes itemize Nico and sometimes a Mumu if you end up playing a Mumu. Yasuo Reroll is still a thing, but it is one of the most conditional comps in the game. You need to have Yasuo headline with a lot of Yasuos. You need to have good items for Yasuo or the proper item augment, like not today to start off at 2-1. You absolutely need to hit on time or even early. Like you want to hit Yasuo that latest at 3-1. You want to make sure you get stacks properly on Yasuo. So a lot of times you don't want to play like 2 Yasuo 2s because one Yasuo might steal a stacks. But at the same time, that might be your strongest board. So you kind of struggle with this dynamic. And you really want to be able to push levels to get to Kiana on level 9 or to go for 7 edgelords if you're able to play for Kayn. And so there's so many different things that need to go right for Yasuo that almost feels like it's just something you don't play very often. But it is pretty sweet we can get online because once you get the stacks and the stacks starts to tally up, Yasuo can get pretty insane. It's just that it's hard to get there consistently. Reroll Yone is the final composition here, and for good reason. Yone is just contested across the board. A lot of people are going to pick up Yones if they're playing Heartsteel, which is why one of the conditions to play this is there's no Heartsteel players in the lobby because they just randomly take your Yone 2s and you're just going to hit really late. And you look across the board, Zed contested, Kiana impossible to hit, Mordekaiser contested, Viugan contested, Echo contested, and yes, even Kaos are picked up as well as part of those Pentakill comps. So it's just really hard to hit this Yone. And if you do manage to find Yone 3, you should just buy a lottery ticket because you are high rolling. That being said, if you do find Yone 3 and find a good setup for him with the IE Hodge and Titan Resolve or just AD in general, still really solid. Just very, very hard to hit. Woo! Whew, that was a lot of comps. As I said, there's a lot of diversity in set 10 and many different ways that you can play your game pending on your spots if you know the conditions. It's a lot to break down, so I don't blame you if you only watch part of it or you want to come back to a certain time when you realize you're in the spot for it. But I pretty much covered all the main comps. That being said, there's still a few other like obscure things that we didn't talk about. You know, like there's like a Gnar reroll, or sometimes people play like Corki or weird obscure things. Maybe you want to try Garen Reroll. So if you have some extra tech, feel free to drop in the comments below, and maybe I'll see a cool VOD review that we can do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.